Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this 25th CRWDP webinar. My name is Kathy Petkapaeva. I'm the National Manager with the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy, and I'm very pleased to facilitate this webinar today. Here's how the webinar will run. I will first introduce our speaker, Dr. Robyn O'Loughlin. Then Robyn will make her presentation, and then after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. But before we start the webinar, I feel honored about the opportunity to state the land acknowledgement. As a settler who came to Canada from Eastern Europe less than 15 years ago, I respect and acknowledge the land I'm on now, and I express my gratitude for the privilege to live here. And the awareness of where we are situated in the cultural and in the social space, it's always important. And especially important for us today at this meeting, where we will be discussing the experiences of Indigenous students in high schools in Ontario. So the acknowledgement states, we wish to acknowledge this land on which we live and work. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This acknowledgement is for where I am in the Greater Toronto area, and please also understand and acknowledge the land you are on. So now I will introduce our speaker, Dr. Robyn O'Loughlin. She holds a PhD from Carleton University in Law and Legal Studies. Her dissertation research focuses on Ontario anti-bullying framework and its potential impact on Indigenous students who move off reserve to attend high school in Northern Ontario. She is a Mitacs-funded postdoctoral fellow in Indigenous Workplace Studies with the Department of Health Sciences at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And she works in partnership with the Institute for Work and Health. Her postdoctoral research relates to workplace bullying, violence, and harassment, and its potential impact on First Nations workers. All right, so now please take it away, Robyn.
All right, thank you. So I want to start by thanking you all for being here, and I also will give a land acknowledgement. So I am located on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation, a signatory to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. And as Kathy mentioned, I am located in Thunder Bay, Ontario. So before I dive into my research, I would like to inform you of how I became interested in conducting research that impacts Indigenous people. I acknowledge I'm not Indigenous. I also have European ancestry, as my dad is from Ireland. So in 2000, I heard about the first missing Indigenous youth, Jethro Anderson, who had been attending Dennis Franklin Cromartie High School in Thunder Bay. I remember crossing the James Street Bridge over the Kaministiquia River to the Fort William First Nation Reserve and seeing a group of people on the riverbank. At the time, I didn't realize what they were doing, but I later discovered that Jethro had been found deceased where I had seen the people. And when I returned to Thunder Bay from Ottawa in 2014, I joined the Thunder Bay Anti-Racism Committee, and discussions were had about racism plaguing the city. I questioned why Indigenous people were not treated the same as everyone else. And this question became more bothersome to me when I realized the high number of deaths of Indigenous youth in the Thunder Bay community since 2000. So spanning a decade, 7 students died attending school in Thunder Bay at Dennis Franklin Cromartie High School. So I localized the context of my PhD dissertation to the 7 Youth Inquest and what anti-bullying meant for Indigenous youth. There were also a few other things that shifted my line of thinking to Indigenous peoples in Northern Ontario, and specifically my community of Thunder Bay. So there were my discussions with my PhD supervisor at the beginning of my PhD, my time on the Anti-Racism Committee, learning about my grandmother's own experience of forced institutionalization at the Fort William Sanatorium, where she was medically experimented on, and then the memory of the searchers looking for Jethro. My heart aches for Indigenous youth in Thunder Bay, and all of these things motivated me to want to do this research. I wanted to turn attention to how Ontario's anti-bullying framework potentially impacted their lives. So the project that I present to you today stems from my dissertation work. So the objective of my dissertation was to understand how educators are applying the Ontario anti-bullying framework to Indigenous students when instances defined as bullying take place. And today I will discuss how settler colonialism is seen in the workplace with a focus on these educators and their implementation of policy in school, with a discussion of how anti-bullying legislation can prevent future harm for students as they work through the school system. And then I will discuss my postdoctoral research at Lakehead University as it ties nicely in. So the context of my study, Indigenous youth are forced to navigate politics to attend school. Promoting educational equity for Indigenous people is complicated as they're stuck in educational purgatory. Indigenous students are mandated by federal jurisdiction, whereas everyone else is provincial. For an Indigenous student to attend school off reserve, tripartite agreements must be in place. One of the most important factors in ensuring that Indigenous students have equitable access to education within the context of complex jurisdictional issues, historical discrimination, socioeconomic and geographic barriers is the requirement to keep Indigenous students safe while they are attending school. This leads to the consideration of Ontario's anti-bullying framework. Although I won't discuss the anti-bullying framework, I will briefly state that I argue that the term bullying obfuscates behavior such as discrimination, racism, violence, and harassment. And there is a generalized definition of bullying now included in the Education Act, which educators are mandated to follow. So the theoretical context of my research. So I did use a settler colonialism theoretical concept. Settler colonialism in the Canadian context refers to the European invasion whereby Indigenous people were dehumanized and families were separated and their land was taken away. The Canadian state has implied that it is not a racist country since former Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized to Indigenous Canadians that were victims of the residential schools in the 60s scoop on June 11th, 2008, but not much has been done to help Indigenous youth obtain an education. Excuse me. Indigenous children from remote reserves in Northern Ontario are pushed out of their communities to attend secondary school elsewhere, funneled into an environment where they are more likely to face discrimination, harassment, violence, and racism for a variety of reasons. Children whose parents were part of the residential schools in the 60s scoop are required to function without consideration for their unique histories. Educators have expectations of parents without thinking about larger issues that may impact relationships. There is a need to be aware of how policies may disproportionately negatively impact Indigenous students, and there is also a need to be aware of how educators understand and implement these new policies on these Indigenous students. There are risks posed by Ontario's anti-bullying legislation and policies for Indigenous students. The policies may not necessarily benefit Indigenous youth if they are not deemed worthy of protection by their teachers, while at the same time the educators, by focusing on bullying, may make things worse by camouflaging systemic sources of violence faced by Indigenous students. I used a qualitative methodology for this research. I emailed 12 Northern school boards to ask for consideration of my proposal and was invited to have meetings with 2 directors of education. Although these 2 commented on how timely my research was, they formally declined any participation in my work. 8 others either said no or they did not respond, but 2 DOEs did respond positively to my proposal, and I know where most of my participants come from. I also had 1 Indigenous Education Authority that agreed to participate. Despite asking over 600 potential participants, only 12 educators responded to my request. One of those teachers was also a JK teacher who was outside of my pool of participants, but nevertheless, I did include their data. So I conducted 11 interviews and received 1 set of written responses from participants. And from the data I collected, there is a view into how settler colonialism remains in the education system. I used a multi-grounded theoretical approach, and my analysis is informed by theoretical frameworks of settler colonialism and the social construction of bullying. I adopted some of the two-eyed seeing approach in my data analysis, and two-eyed seeing is the gift of multiple perspectives relative to my research. It's also about recognizing value and necessity in formal education. However, it's also recognizing the rich value of informal education that occurs in non-institutional settings, such as community gatherings, family story sharing, and mentorship relationships. So I did consult with an Indigenous researcher while analyzing my interview transcripts, and I met with this person for approximately 1 year. And as an academic, I am trained to be critical of social structures, laws, and policies and their implementation in society. So listening to the Indigenous researcher and searching for both positive and negative impacts was important when adopting some aspects of the two-eyed seeing approach in my analysis. Unlearning to always focus on the negative impacts takes time and effort, and recognition of positive situations in both the Western and Indigenous perspective brings research back to the teaching of the two-row wampum belt, where Western and Indigenous knowledge are shared and developed based on positive relationships and respect. So themes that developed from educators that related to settler colonialism in the workplace include the recognition that the political and social atmosphere in Northern Ontario is very different from Southern Ontario. Not only is the geographical space different, but the infrastructure and the social expectations are different. Participants who were raised in Northern Ontario referenced racism, harassment, and violence against Indigenous people, whereas participants from Southern Ontario who had moved to Northern Ontario were not aware of Indigenous politics until their university or work experiences. Some participants even suggested that Indigenous youth need to be more resilient as society moves further away from the residential school era. So participants' responses, this is just some of them. So colonial educators and Indigenous students. So one participant stated, "How does one know if you're sitting with somebody who is Indigenous?" Another participant stated, "I was an ignorant kid too. I didn't understand why things were the way they were, and I didn't have anyone to guide me towards that understanding either." Another participant stated that Indigenous people were kind of invisible to me. Another participant stated that their parents talked about First Nations people like they were subhuman. Another one who was from Southern Ontario moving to Northern Ontario stated, "Moving up here, I feel like I've gone backwards in time." Another participant who grew up in Northern Ontario and lived in Northern Ontario at the time of this interview said, "It certainly is concerning how much trauma there is and the trauma that you see in the streets." Another participant from Southern Ontario stated that Indigenous people were trying to be treated like farm animals. Another Indigenous participant stated that it's taken this long to recognize it, the trauma from residential schools, so it's going to take this long to fix the problem. It's generations and generations and generations. Another participant who is a settler working at the Indigenous Education Authority said that, Indigenous students recognize that we're trying, and also stated that if it's not localized, it's not authentic. So based on the responses provided, 3 participants from Northern Ontario and 2 participants from Southern Ontario were less aware of Indigenous issues until they attended post-secondary education, where they encountered critically meaningful and relevant information about Indigenous history and politics. I hesitate to say that they learned Indigenous history and politics, because an underlying theme of this data was that learning is a process that involves a level of introspection and empathy. Until participants had their own experiences that put Indigenous history and politics into perspective, they were unable to comprehend the expansive impact of residential schools and colonialism. And it is noted that the experiences and other experiences with Indigenous people impacted their relationships with Indigenous people moving forward, where they were able to shift away from experience or stereotypes that they once held and move to an understanding of Indigenous culture. And sometimes this only occurred when they did move into a new community. So from Southern Ontario to Northern Ontario. Participants generally were knowledgeable about Indigenous politics, history, and cultures, but this knowledge was certainly increased as a result of teaching in schools with significant Indigenous populations. Also, participants reported an increased knowledge of Indigenous ways of knowing as a result of exposure to Indigenous students and elders in a school setting. Almost all participants expressed support for increasing Indigenous content in school curricula and identified ways in which their own teaching practices had incorporated Indigenous knowledge and methods. One participant, the JK teacher, did not know that Indigenous youth move off reserve to attend high school, but other participants stated that having to move would be devastating. You'll never replace the loving care and touch of a parent or family member. When discussing the potential impact of the term bullying on Indigenous students, participants viewed bullying incidents involving both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students through the same individualized lens. Most of the participants thought Indigenous students might benefit from being more resilient. Participants discussed resiliency as both the responsibility of Indigenous youth, as well as the solution to the political issues they navigate. The onus of moving past the trauma Indigenous people experience was thus put on the shoulders of Indigenous youth. Rather than offering suggestions to improve the behaviors of non-Indigenous students and educators, Indigenous youth were to blame. Indigenous students, particularly those attending school away from their home communities, have already been put into uncomfortable and vulnerable positions just to be able to attend school to obtain an education. Requiring Indigenous youth to take responsibility for making themselves less attractive targets of negative behavior is inequitable. However, some participants recognize the social shift, particularly since the TRC calls to action were published in 2015. Some more participant responses, awareness and implementation of the Ontario Anti-Bullying Framework in schools. So some participants did recognize that people just slap on the word bullying to minimize harassment and discrimination. And another participant recognized that bullying really minimizes what the actual issues are. So some participants did talk about their conditions of employment and just checking boxes. So there's a webinar that some teachers would take. So that would be their Ontario Anti-Bullying Framework training. They would all sit in a circle, do it together, tick all the boxes, done, they have their certificate. Another participant did state that we're not always going to go to the framework when we know something that will work better for our kids. So some participants did have their own assumptions of what bullying was based on their own experiences and not necessarily going to the framework. Some more participant responses. One participant stated, we're making strides as a country, but people are still ignorant and closed-minded and racist. Another one stated, it's going to take a long time. Another one said, be proud of who you are, stand up for yourself, don't let somebody else push you around. And another participant stated, for a meaningful relationship to occur with their Indigenous students, the relationship has to be slow and it has to be authentic. So moving forward, relative to inclusion of Indigenous youth, educators need to keep in mind that in many cases, they are teaching children of residential school survivors. Some parents in Indigenous families who suffer from traumatic experiences of residential schools and the 60s scoop are not equipped to stand up to an educator or to provide other support for their youth. The educators need to consistently be reflexive of their own attitudes, their own assumptions, and their own values when they're teaching Indigenous students. So the results, interestingly, participants who were aware of the challenges faced by Indigenous students did not recognize the mainstream conception of bullying may work to disadvantage Indigenous students. And this is why it's important to be aware of how the anti-bullying framework may disadvantage students, but if people are aware of it, it actually may prevent future harm going forward as well, because they'd recognize the gaps in the anti-bullying framework. The cumulative impact of these findings suggests that a new theoretical insight derived from this data concerning a way in which mainstream discourse of bullying may act to reinforce settler colonial foundations in the educational system, and the reproduction of this may be facilitated by all educators, even those who are aware of the critiques of the anti-bullying framework and how Indigenous youth could be disadvantaged by it. So the need for educator self-reflection is heightened by the fact that it is very unlikely that a unified approach by all educators as to how policies should be implemented in schools will develop. Everyone brings their own unique experiences to the classroom. The question is whether or not educators can critically evaluate their experiences, their attitudes, and their assumptions, and how these may impact the students they teach, particularly Indigenous students. And relative to the anti-bullying framework, it is important that educators recognize that they may minimize negative behavior, such as sexual harassment, violence, and racism, by naming it as bullying, despite the fact that the Ontario legislation requires harsher consequences when behavior is motivated by sex, sexual orientation, or race. The marginalization of anti-Indigenous racism serves to further reinforce settler colonialism within the education system. So it must be noted that the participants in my research may be different than other teachers they work with. They volunteered to participate in this type of research study. Like I said, I asked over approximately 600 people and I got 12. Their participation may indicate a higher level of investment in the well-being of their Indigenous students than among other teachers. However, there is difficulty in helping their Indigenous students succeed when they are educated themselves in a colonial education system, and then they are expected to teach the same colonial system that they were educated in. And the participants may not also have the tools or the skills to fully recognize and appreciate what systemic issues Indigenous youth are navigating, but their intentions and investment to help are present despite teaching in the colonial system that resists decolonization and education. The findings in my research show that even those who are aware may not take Indigenous history, and particularly the history of settler colonialism, into account when assessing student actions. And this is even more important that educators develop relationships with Indigenous people, communities, and organizations to experience Indigenous culture firsthand and develop deeper appreciation for the Indigenous history, culture, and experiences. Moving towards an accepting and trusting relationship takes time and patience. People should not expect anything in return for the development of a relationship. The relationship itself is something to honor and to respect. So now that I've graduated from Carleton University for my PhD just this past June, I am now a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Health Sciences at Lakehead University. I am funded through a MyTax grant partnered between EPID at Work Research Institute and the Institute for Work and Health. I'm also funded partially through Dr. Vicki Christman's SSHRC Partnership Development Grant and a CIHR Project Scheme grant that I am also a co-investigator on. So my postdoc project is titled Bullying Purposely Left Out, Canada's Amended Labor Code and its Potential Impact on First Nations Workers. I'll give you a little bit of background about that project. So workplace discrimination is common for First Nations people, and unacceptable behaviors may take place at work, such as threats, intimidation, or violence. And the workplace is a location where behaviors labeled as bullying occurs. When examining First Nations workers, the impacts of behavior defined as bullying and the mere act of defining the behavior as bullying rather than violence, harassment, or racism may be exacerbated given the unique history of Indigenous people. So my proposed research on bullying behaviors experienced at work by First Nations population has been largely overlooked by existing research on bullying at work and on the legislative and legal responses to it. There are many Canadian employment policies that do not define bullying. Federally, Canada's Labor Code and Canada's Occupational Health and Safety regulations do not define bullying. In Ontario, bullying is poorly defined, but in lay terms, bullying is defined as aggression at work. Workplace violence, however, is defined as the exercise of physical force by a person against a worker in a workplace that causes or could cause physical injury to the worker. And on October 25th, 2018, the Canada Labour Code was amended, strengthening the existing framework for the prevention of harassment and violence under Bill C-65. Bill C-65 recognizes harassment and violence in the workplace as a national issue. The definition of harassment and violence are defined as any actions, conduct, or comment that can reasonably be expected to cause offense, humiliation, or other physical or psychological injury or illness to any employee. Workplace harassment and violence are factors that are associated with the term bullying. However, not all employers define bullying as workplace harassment. The Canada Labour Code leaves the definition of workplace violence and harassment policy up to the employer. And this may be challenging, especially if the employer simply states that negative behavior is defined as harassment, as bullying, or if they do not acknowledge Indigenous culture traditions at all. So the term bullying appears to be convenient, and if an individual wants to get away with negative behavior, they may joke about their actions, possibly knowing that they are inappropriate. If the negative behavior is towards a First Nations worker, rather than naming the behavior as harassment or violence, it may be simply lessened as bullying. And bullying is ingrained in the social consciousness as something that legitimately happens, and laws and policies that govern acceptable behavior in the workplace need to be critically analyzed for how they deal with issues of violence and harassment, including the degree of which the laws and policies are socially constructed using the terms bullying. The Canada Centre for Occupational Health and Safety argues that there is no way to predict who may or may not be the bully or target in the workplace, but also states that there is a fine line between strong management and bullying. So is strong management an alternative is strong management an alternative to allow bullying in the workplace, or does strong management reinforce colonial relationships in the workplace, leaving First Nations people in vulnerable positions? And for First Nations workers, it is important to feel spiritually, emotionally, and mentally connected to their identity and to their community. When a First Nations worker is disconnected from their identity due to instances of bullying in the workplace, their health and well-being is at risk. The population of Indigenous people in Canada is rapidly growing, and there are expected to be, I believe it's 3 million more people, Indigenous people in Canada. The Canadian workforce is moving towards acceptance of Indigenous employees and their culture, but not all employers are accepting of Indigenous cultures. Therefore, there is the need to examine whether or not behavior in the workplace involving First Nations workers is labeled as bullying, or if it's labeled as harassment and violence in the workplace. So this project is, it's been developed with Nokiwin Tribal Council in Thunder Bay. In March 2019, I was invited to a conference they hosted in Toronto titled An Inside Job, Solutions from Within. And at this conference, there was a discussion of Bill C-65. And it's through these discussions that bullying and lateral violence in the workplace was discussed as a recurring theme. So violence and harassment is a topic of concern for many First Nations workers. And as my doctoral work is on the concept of bullying in schools, which behavior is paralleled in the workplace, I questioned whether the term bullying from the amendments to Canada's Labour Code, how does the gap impact First Nations workers? Okay, so the overall objective of my project, I basically want to know what are the experiences of workers around bullying and harassment. It is a qualitative project. I'm asking workers if they have experienced negative workplace behavior, and I want to understand factors that are relative to negative workplace behavior. So if a complaint of harassment and violence has been made under Canada's Labour Code, how was it dealt with in the workplace? How did their supervisor handle it? The first portion of this project, like I said, is qualitative. I want to interview 36 federal workers, so 12 First Nations, 12 immigrant workers, and 12 non-First Nation Canadian citizens to ask them about their workplace experiences. And I will create a semi-structured questionnaire asking them to describe any negative workplace behavior. And I'll ask them to also provide their understanding of bullying, harassment, and violence in the workplace. And I will ask them how they believe their supervisor and coworkers also interpreted the behavior that took place. I do have the previous executive director of the First Nations Safety Council of BC on board with this project, and Okiwan Tribal Council in Thunder Bay on board with this project. And I also have the Indigenous Wellness and Knowledge Center in Edmonton, Alberta on board as well. So I am currently in the position right now of obtaining ethics for this project. And once I have ethics, then I will start recruiting participants. And again, I would just like to acknowledge, sorry, before we go to feedback and questions, that I am funded through Lakehead University's EPIT at Work, MyTax, Institute for Work and Health, SSHRC, CIHR. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Robyn. It was a very interesting presentation, including your PhD research and postdoctoral research. And it looks like, although anti-bullying states that no bullying behavior is tolerated, it's not the case for all students, and especially marginalized students or Indigenous students who don't feel protected by that framework. So I'm looking forward to your questions. You can type your questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box. You can also raise your hand if you would like to be unmuted, and then you can speak and ask your question or provide a comment. And while we are waiting for the questions to come, I'm curious about a few things. So my first question is that I was really stunned by the tremendous challenges that you experienced in the recruitment process for your dissertation research. So now you're planning to recruit workers and ask about their experiences in the workplace. Do you think you will face similar challenges? And also, what are you thinking about how to, maybe change your approach to recruiting to prevent these challenges?
So recruitment for my PhD was very difficult. I did get the comment from the Carleton REB as well, like, good luck with educators. It's very hard to get past the gatekeepers being the directors of education. And as a naive first-year PhD student, I didn't think anything of it, because being on the anti-racism committee in Thunder Bay, I had networked with many educators who wanted to jump in and participate in this project. However, they couldn't, because I needed approval from some DOE, from certain DOEs, and without that, they couldn't participate. So I think on that aspect, I learned very much how politics is a part of that, and how when you are working for a school board, you basically are owned by the school board to participate in research. For this, my postdoc project, I do have connections with the First Nations groups that I mentioned. And by having those connections and recognizing that this project is done in partnership with Indigenous communities, I'm not doing it on Indigenous people, I'm doing it with and for. And also having the connections through IWH and Dr. Chrisman and the First Nations group, as I mentioned. And also I have a personal connection to, through the department, who is aware of some people working in the federal industry, where I would like to recruit participants. So I'm hopeful that 36 participants will not be difficult to obtain, but we'll see, given the fact that 12 teachers out of 600, we'll see what it's like. From past experiences and other projects that I'm working on at Lakehead, I know immigrant newcomer workers want to talk, especially about negative behavior they've experienced in the workplace. And women in the trades want to talk about negative behavior that they've experienced. But those are completely separate projects from this, so I'm not going to talk about those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, through connections, hopefully you will be able to recruit your participants, and I'm really wishing you good luck and all the best with recruitment, and we look forward to hearing these voices.
Thank
who
you.
have been silenced. And yeah. So we have a couple of questions. I'm going to read them. Thank you for an interesting presentation, Robyn. I know your focus was on bullying of students, but did you encounter any educator experiences of bullying? This is a very interesting question. What would you say?
Some of the educators did talk about that they were segregated, some that would help their Indigenous students versus those that wouldn't. So they would talk about like coffee room gossip and being, just segregated, like, oh, I help versus don't help and just do whatever. And then there's also educators spoke about these programs that they have in place that, you know, they can make notes on certain students to either help or not help, and whether or not other teachers gave their opinion on how to help the students or whether they just let it be. That's the only thing that came out of my research with educator on educator discussions around negative behavior in the school.
Is this segregation that you mentioned, is it related to how, to the opinions and values of those educators who may be different to the values and opinions of others, right? So it looks like if the culture is different and you're kind of outstanding, you are different from others, then you may be segregated.
Yeah, there were some older teachers that I interviewed who would take matters into their own hands, and then some younger educators who wouldn't do anything beyond what was required, or they would just do whatever they needed to appease administration, rather than taking it, like, going into the context of what's going on here. Why is racism occurring in the school system? Like what's going on? What needs to be addressed?
So it looks like system-wide interventions and education and training are needed so that everyone will be on the same level, in the same space in terms of understanding of the experiences of Indigenous students, experience of racism and violence and harassment, right?
Yes, and also the context and the communities in which you live and which the school is actually operating in. A lot of my schools were in the north and had a high population of Indigenous peoples, or people coming from reserve to come to school there, and they still face stereotypes. There were stereotypes of Indigenous town kids who live in that community to go to, who have grown up there and go to school there, versus kids coming from a remote reserve to attend high school. So there was that amongst community differences in the Indigenous population versus non-Indigenous kids in the community that live there. And then there was also the added layer of some of these communities have a lot of newcomers to Canada who are being placed in these northern communities. I'm not quite sure what the incentives are for that, but that does occur in Northern Ontario, beyond Thunder Bay.
Thank you so much. I guess for those of us who don't live in Northern Ontario, we don't really know these dynamics and details. So thanks for providing that.
And that's actually something that came up in my work for future research, is to conduct the same study in Southern Ontario with Southern school boards to determine if educators in the South are aware of the politics that their Indigenous students navigate if there's only even a handful of Indigenous students in the classroom.
Yeah, That's a great point. These differences can be really striking. All right, so we have a couple of other questions. Hi, Robyn. Thank you for your presentation. It was awesome. I have a question about how workplaces can foster a culture where employees feel comfortable and supported coming forward about bullying and harassment. I often see folks citing the need to prove their allegations or feeling they won't be believed. How can employers better work to remove these barriers and perceptions?
I think education of laws and policies that the workplace follows would be step one. I'm not in a position to provide legal advice, but if you have somebody to speak to who is open-minded about having these conversations and obviously keeping the conversation confidential, I think that would be somewhere to start. It is very hard because sometimes organizational culture and climate are negative, and how can we shift it to be positive? And I think a lot of that does take education of the entire workplace, and everybody needs to be on the same page.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, we talk about the systemic changes that are required.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question. Will there be any direct look into the additional oppression experienced by Indigenous workers with disabilities? That's a great question.
That is a great question. I'm going to write that down.
Intersectionality, basically, that you touched on in your PhD research, but perhaps you will go a bit further with your postdoctoral studies.
Yes, I have not thought about whether to include disability as a layer, but I can. I think that is a fabulous point, actually. So I'm going to write it down here so that when I do end up completing the interviews and the analysis, I can add that layer of intersectionality to it. Thank you very much for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Robyn. So consider it a special ask from CRWDP community to discuss disability and work, and hopefully we will see you again at another CRWDP webinar in a year or two discussing those things.
Perfect, thank you.
So there is another question. Could you speak on how to support and educate, protect the educators and teachers with the school districts? Thank you. Question from Dawn.
Can you repeat it again?
Could you speak on how to support and educate, protect the educators and teachers with the school districts?
So the educators that are there, they want to be there. They're not forced to be working in the school board that they're in, because I do know that a lot of these school boards have trouble finding good teachers, because some teachers just say, I need to pay off my student debt. I'm going to go teach in the north, pay off their student debt and leave. Whereas the educators that I've been, or that I interviewed, have been there for 10 plus years. Like, they want to make a difference in the community. They care about their students. They want them to succeed. What's interesting is the backlash that these educators get from parents outside, like at the grocery store, when curriculum changes take place. So for instance, one thing that had happened was the English curriculum shifted to include more First Nation content. Well, they did the content change first in the essential level and applied level courses, because that's where there were more First Nations kids, rather than the academic stream. And then when it hit the academic stream, there was a lot of backlash from community members, the parents of these children, not wanting to learn about First Nations content, which is very upsetting. And so actually what one educator did was they hosted a community gathering with elders, and they had that movie Indian Horse playing. And it was just a knowledge session for anybody in the community to come out to talk about their experiences, to educate each other in a safe space. And then they also brought in the students. They would have specific showings for classes to come in. And I mean, they needed permission, parental permission, in order for the kids to go to these sessions. But that was one way that the school board itself was trying to help the communities at large. One thing I will note is that this one school board that I did get in touch with, very much so about including Indigenous culture and traditions in their laws and policies. So both the school boards were very much in touch with the Indigenous traditions and cultures of their students, and that was present in the schools themselves. I actually went to some of the schools, part of the school boards, and I was able to see this firsthand. Definitely the school boards are there to help their Indigenous students succeed. Versus other school boards, when I would look at their policies, they were just, black and white, this is what it is. Whereas these ones went beyond into the community to incorporate Indigenous culture and traditions, which I thought was exemplary.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, this is the way to go, and those schools and boards can educate others on how to do it, hopefully.
Yeah.
So Dawn provided a few more comments to her question, and I think you already reflected on them and addressed them. So she's talking about Indigenous students should be more protected, and social education is needed. So through building the community and through engaging and really going beyond the check boxes, check marks, this is how you can move forward, right? That's what I'm hearing from you, Robyn.
Yeah, and it is hard for. So there was one instance that an educator spoke about. This one student whose mother was from a reserve, and then whose boyfriend lived in the town that the school was at, and so the person would talk about their connection to the reserve and how they really appreciate it, they love the reserve, they love their First Nation, but then they were suffering from lateral violence from friends of theirs who actually were on reserve all the time, because they would say to this person, well, you get to leave the reserve, like you get to go and stay in town, you don't have to stay on the reserve, because the reserve was an 1.5-hour bus ride away. Mm-hmm. And so the nearest grocery store, like they would have one store, a gas station, and it would sell maybe candy, some snacks, things like that, but not grocery store. There's no opportunity for extracurriculars if the kids are being sent back home on the bus that takes an 1.5 hours each way to get there. So there are implications for Indigenous youth attending school off reserve, especially when they have to navigate all the politics. They may not have ever seen a stoplight. They may not know what crosswalks look like. They may not know these things, and then they unfortunately may also have a substandard education up to grade 8, and then be forced to have the same education, reading level, math skills, etc. when they attend high school, which then possibly they might need and probably need more education to bring them up to speed, so to speak, alongside the rest of the peers in the school. And then what does that look like? What type of layers are added to that? Does the person supporting them support them fully and understand where they're coming from? Do they recognize the trauma that their parents may have endured in residential school, 60 scoop, whatever the case may be? There are opportunities for bias, even attending, like shifting to come to high school, that need to be navigated. There's many different factors. And then to just say that Indigenous youth need to be more resilient, well, that's easier said than done.
That's right. And all these layers, starting from geographical transportation and how to navigate that kind of starting high school in terms of what level of education you have, like what type of education you receive. These are a lot of factors that you need to think about. So thank you so much for providing these details. We kind of start to build the picture of how does it look and what those experiences are of students.
Yeah, and if I can connect it to the workplace too here, a lot of First Nations kids in the schools where I interviewed the educators are in the essential stream. So that just goes essential to the workplace. Whereas if they're in the applied stream, they can go from applied to college. But if you're in the academic stream, you can take, university level or college level courses. But most, like I just said, are in the essentials. So then they were actually pushed by a certain guidance counselor at one of the schools that, you could just go here because you don't understand the complexity in the applied or academic stream courses, which is problematic, very problematic to just be here, let's push a certain population over here. And then other educators acknowledge that too, because when the curriculum shifts happened, they started in the essential streams because that's where most First Nations kids were. Problematic.
Yeah, that's very disturbing, and that talks about biases.
Yeah.
Bias of everyone who was involved and who didn't really think outside the box about how to, just distressing. So I think Dawn provided another comment. So we can see each other as a person and have a more genuine understanding of each other. Yeah, that's I think I agree. So that's what we are talking about here, and the examples that you provide, and just reflecting and understanding on your biases, how you view different people, how you view those people who are already marginalized. So this is important to move beyond that and move to human interaction.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see a question. So we still have a few minutes and you can ask a question, but I will use this opportunity to ask you another question.
Sure.
So it's a bit provocative. So you talked a lot about the ambiguous nature of the word bullying, which is too convenient to use, and you can hide violence and harassment experiences and ignore them basically by using this word. So maybe what do you think about stopping to use the word bullying at all?
In an ideal world, that would be good, but I know that that's never going to happen. Bullying, the term bullying will always be there. Goes back to the roots, I think, of what I've learned in my legal studies program is who are laws and policies developed for, generally for people in power. And so if bullying is listed, I think it's going to be used for people in power to minimize the competitive nature of society, because it's a lot easier to say, oh, I'm just bullying someone or I'm just bullying them versus saying, oh, I actually harassed them or I was violent to them, because harassment and violence have repercussions in the workplace, criminal repercussions. You can get written up for these things. Whereas, do you always get written up for bullying? Probably not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really a lot to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I also have another question, just making sure that no one else has posted another question. So in your dissertation, you say that Indigenous youth are vulnerable in multiple ways because they are othered. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about this word othered, which I think it's a very deep word?
Sure. So actually, I talked about this a little bit this morning in my other presentation I gave. So laws and policies are basically developed for those in power, but based on masculine, heteronormative, middle class society. And so basically, if you don't match anything of that criteria, you're othered. And Judith Butler came up with that terminology. So because a First Nations person is not going to be white, a white male, basically they're othered. A lot of First Nations communities in Northern Ontario have no infrastructure or very low infrastructure, very low economy, very low education, are lucky if they have running water, a home. Like there's all these factors that impact their well-being. And if they can't navigate the politics, it's very hard to navigate these politics. You know, a lot of people are provided with funding from the band, but if the funding from the band, well, from the government to the band, right, and then gets dispersed, that money is barely enough to live, let alone other people from looking from the outside at these Indigenous communities obtaining all this money. Make sure the quotes are there. People don't recognize how expensive it is on reserve to have food, water flown into them, you know, having to navigate that. That's why sometimes it's easier to have pop than it is to have water or milk. They don't recognize the cost differences and how inflated the cost of food and housing is in the North. And I think that's something that's important as we discuss otherness. I mean, it's a very deep topic, but just to put it into perspective, or deep concept, sorry, but just to put it into perspective, that's I think what needs to be said here.
Thank you a lot, Robyn. So thanks. It's really eye-opening, those details that you provide. And similar to myself, I suppose that some of the attendees here at the webinar, some of the things you didn't know. So thanks for this opportunity to hear about that. So there is another comment. Thank you very much for doing this research. Listening to this presentation has taught me even more of the negative experiences faced by Indigenous students at even present time. And I agree with the person who provided this comment. So thank you so much, Robyn, for your presentation. And we are almost at 1 p.m. Eastern. So I would like to thank you again for this great presentation and for the discussion, and thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion. Also, I would like to thank Sabrina Imam and Dan Samash, who helped to make these webinars possible. So we will be posting the information about the next webinar on the CRWDP website. This is www.crwdp.ca under the CRWDP webinar page. And if you are interested to be a presenter, or if you know anyone who could be a great presenter and who is advancing the topic of work and disability, you can email to us at info@crwdp.ca. So thank you again for attending. Thank you, the presenter, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.